Hello and welcome to Advent with the Prophets. I'm Richard Ounsworth, speaking to you from Holy Cross Priory in Leicester, and this is the second in our series. If you haven't seen the first one, please watch that first. In that first episode, I promised that I would talk about the prophet Jeremiah, and in particular about the distinction between prophets telling the future and prophets telling the present. Permit me to explain. In the 1960s, and even a little bit maybe further back, it started to become the kind of thing that biblical scholars wanted to say, that prophecy isn't really about telling the future, it's about telling the present. An expression you would often get would be not so much foretelling as forthtelling. And there is some truth in this, although, as I mentioned last time, in most of the prophetic books, pretty much all of them, there are a lot of future tense verbs. It is also the case that many of the prophets tell people how God sees things at the moment. This is God's take on our present reality. And I think that's especially the case with the prophet Jeremiah. Jeremiah lived in extremely turbulent times. He saw, during the course of his lifetime, the siege of Jerusalem by the Babylonians, during which time he had the misfortune to be put down a well, which can't have been very nice, but don't worry, he was rescued. Although in the end, when Jerusalem was captured, Jeremiah was taken off not by the Babylonians, but against his will, by his own people into exile in Egypt. Jeremiah, I think at the time, would have seemed to most of the occupants of Jerusalem as a traitor. He explained that Babylon, although enemies of the people, were doing the will of God. It was God's will to punish his people for their many, many sins by allowing their city to be taken and even their temple to be destroyed by the Babylonians. And he said the only way in which we can save anything out of the wreckage of this disastrous situation, which we have brought upon ourselves, is by submitting to God's will. And what that means is submitting to the Babylonians. I often say that this must have felt a bit like if somebody had said in 1940, the Nazis are doing the will of God and we should submit to them. Now, let me be perfectly plain. The Nazis weren't doing the will of God and we were right not to submit to them. But supposing somebody had said that to you in 1940, how would you have thought of that person? You would have thought of them as a monster, as a wicked collaborator with evil. And it's very, very clear from the book of Jeremiah itself that that is how Jeremiah was seen by many of his people. There were a whole load of official prophets, kind of royal prophets, probably in the temple in Jerusalem, who said, don't you worry, everything's going to be fine, God is on our side, he won't let anything bad happen. To which Jeremiah responded essentially with, oh yes, he will. And they did not want to hear this. I often think about this when I look at some of the things that Christ said in the Gospels. Think about when, for example, he says, if anyone makes you go with him 1 mile, go 2 miles with him. If anybody wants to take your coat, let him take your tunic as well. What kind of person is stealing your clothes in first century Jerusalem? What kind of person is making you go on a forced march in first century Jerusalem? The answer, of course, is the Romans. I think Christ would have been heard as saying, collaborate with the Romans, just as Jeremiah was heard as saying, collaborate with the Babylonians. The first point to take away from all of this, I suppose, is that when a prophet gives you a God's eye view of reality, that view of reality is not always going to be congenial. It's not always going to be what you want to hear, and it's not always going to be something that your fellow human beings are going to find easy to take. It is sometimes necessary for a prophet whether in the 7th or 8th century BC or in the 21st century AD, it is sometimes necessary for a prophet to say things that other people don't want to hear because that prophet has been given a God's eye view of reality, and we must speak the truth boldly, just as Christ spoke the truth boldly even when his wicked generation didn't want to hear what he had to say. I'm thinking in particular now of that passage when Christ speaks in the synagogue in Nazareth. Do you remember? And he says, initially, I'm thinking especially of St. Luke's version of this, which is my favorite because it backs up the point that I want to make much better than the other versions. Jesus initially says, "This prophecy has been fulfilled in your hearing," and everyone spoke well of him and were amazed at him. And then he says, I suppose you'll quote to me the saying, "Physician, heal thyself." And he reminds them about what happened in the time of the prophets Elijah and Elisha, which they don't want to hear. And then Jesus says, no prophet is acceptable in his own country. Now that's subtly different, but importantly different, from the way that that's reported in St. Matthew's Gospel, I think it is. There, we are told that Jesus said, a prophet is not without honor except in his own country. Now, it's very similar, but not the same. It's worth explaining the logical difference. In the latter version, the idea is prophets are honored everywhere except possibly in their own country. But in St. Luke's version, which I think is more accurate to what Jesus actually said, Jesus says a prophet might or might not get some honor, but he definitely will not be acceptable in his own country. Notice what happens. Jesus is spoken well of. People think he's marvelous because he's promised them this fulfillment for which they long. And then he speaks about how sometimes God's fulfillment of his promises doesn't come to his own chosen people, but goes to those outside. And at this point, they turn against him. And as you'll remember, they try to throw him off a hill, but he somehow escapes. And Jesus says, no prophet is acceptable in his own country. In other words, if you're a prophet, you have to not be acceptable. And Jesus makes himself unacceptable and thereby proves his prophetic credentials. In fact, in the whole of St. Luke's Gospel, there's a really important theme of Christ as the prophet. St. Luke knows, obviously, that Jesus Christ is far more than simply a prophet, but he is a prophet. Indeed, he is the prophet. Moses promised in the book of Deuteronomy that in the fullness of time, God would send a prophet, the final prophet. And we would know that that prophet was indeed the true prophet sent by God because what he said would come to pass. Now, Christ comes into the world preaching the good news, telling people to repent and believe in the good news, telling people that he is bringing them salvation, but also speaking about his own forthcoming death and then his resurrection. And that, it seems to me, is really the news that people don't want to hear. They don't want to listen when he says the Son of Man must be handed over into the hands of men and they will kill him. They just don't want to listen. Of course, you know, in particular, in St. Mark's Gospel, how St. Peter says, this mustn't happen to you. And Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. So here is the good news, but it's not heard as good news. It's not congenial to the people who want to hear it. And so they reject him. Jesus, in an ironic kind of way, is rejected by his people precisely because he prophesies that he will be rejected by his people. This is all part of God's plan. But Jesus Christ is the true prophet. He is the one who speaks the truth. He is the one who fulfills this promise that Moses made in the book of Deuteronomy. So Jesus Christ is an authentic prophet and therefore must be despised by his own people. Just like the prophet Jeremiah, so Jesus Christ's message is inevitably political. Christ's message of the good news, Christ's message in particular of good news for the poor, which is strongly emphasized especially in St. Luke's Gospel, naturally has political overtones. Now, I'm not here to tell you how to vote. That's not my job. It's not for priests to tell people how to do their party politics. But it is our job to help you to understand what are the political implications of this Advent season. Because in this Advent season, what we look forward to is the return of the King. In our last episode, I spoke about how the prophet Isaiah looked forward to the return of God to Zion. And famously, he says, "Our God reigns." I expect you know the hymn. Our God is King. And that's something that Advent celebrates in a particular way. This is one of the reasons, I think, why we use the color purple in Advent, because purple is the royal color. In days of yore, going back 2,000 years, I suppose, when a king was coming to visit a city, they would put out the flags for him. And very often, among those flags would be purple flags, because purple is the royal color. Largely because purple was very expensive, but I'm not going into the whole thing about shellfish right now. Ask me about that another time. Purple is expensive, it's associated with royalty, so purple is the color of royalty. This, I think, is why we put out the purple in Advent, because we are looking forward to the return of the King. Jesus Christ, the King who is coming again to judge the living and the dead, just as he came in judgment 2,000 years ago. 2,000 years ago, what did that judgment look like? It looked like Christ crucified. St. John, in his Gospel, especially emphasizes this fact. Now is the judgment of this world, he says. And there he's making reference to Christ. Christ on the cross shows us God's judgment on this world. Christ on the cross is God saying to us, firstly, look what you have done. Look what you have turned society into. You have turned society into a place of hatred, a place of anger, a place of violence. And Christian politics, if you will, Advent politics, is the rejection of those values of hatred, of othering those who are different from ourselves, of despising and rejecting and violence. But secondly, when we look at the cross, we see not only God saying, this is what you have done to the world, we also see God saying, this is how I answer you. This is how I deal with the hatred, the fear, the anger that you have brought. I deal with them by responding with love. I deal with them by responding with perfect self-giving. Jesus Christ pours himself out for us on the cross. And he came into this world precisely to do this. The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. And even as we look forward to Christmas, we see how the coming of Christ is always a coming to serve and to die. Think, for example, about the gifts of the Magi. Yes, gold and frankincense representing his royal estate, but myrrh also, looking forward to the inevitability of his sacrificial death. It's this self-sacrificing love which needs to be at the heart of a prophetic Advent politics. A self-sacrificing love which sees the other as that which we are called to serve, not that which we are called to despise. Which sees the other as that in which we place our hope and find our joy, rather than having fear, anger, and hatred. I didn't think I was going to be as political as I have been when I started giving this talk, but this is how the Spirit has moved me. But the fact of the matter is that Christian theology and the message of Christmas has political overtones. It has necessary political consequences because Christ came to serve humanity. and to save humanity. And as Aristotle tells us, man is a political animal. I invite you this Advent to think about your own political involvement. That doesn't mean do you go out campaigning for a political party. It means, are you involved in society? Are you involved in thinking about and working for a better society? If you are a Christian politician, you are a person of Advent. I wish you all a very joyful and hopeful Advent and a happy Christmas. Goodbye.